The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my mother's voice cut through the wedding reception's gentle murmur like a blade through silk. "Our daughter has always been the family disappointment," Margaret Thornfield announced to a table of relatives, her perfectly manicured fingers gesturing dismissively in my direction. "Failed marriage, struggling financially, living in that tiny apartment while raising Emma alone. We've tried to help, but some people simply cannot rise above their circumstances." What my parents did not know, what they had never bothered to discover in 15 years of treating me like their greatest failure, was that I owned a technology consulting firm worth $18 million, had just signed contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies, and possessed enough evidence of their financial manipulation to destroy the carefully constructed empire they had built on lies and stolen credit for my innovations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Rosewood Country Club's grand ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and arrangements of white roses that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. The occasion was my younger sister Victoria's wedding to Jonathan Whitmore, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, and the entire event represented everything my parents valued: status, appearance, and the illusion of perfection. 300 guests filled the elegant space, a carefully curated collection of business leaders, politicians, and social elites who comprised my parents' world of influence and power. I stood near the bar, watching my 15-year-old daughter Emma navigate conversations with relatives who barely acknowledged her existence, and felt the familiar weight of being perpetually dismissed by the people who should have supported me most. The black cocktail dress I wore was understated but elegant, purchased from a boutique whose prices would have shocked my parents if they had bothered to notice such details. Instead, they saw what they expected to see: their disappointing older daughter, who had somehow managed to scrape together appropriate attire for her sister's society wedding. The narrative my parents had constructed about my life was so deeply ingrained in family mythology that challenging it seemed impossible. According to Margaret and Richard Thornfield's version of events, I was the daughter who had made poor choices, married unwisely, and struggled to maintain stability after my divorce 8 years ago. They'd portrayed themselves as patient, generous parents who had repeatedly offered assistance to their wayward child, only to watch me squander opportunities through lack of ambition and poor judgment. This version of reality served their purposes perfectly. It positioned them as successful, responsible parents whose achievements stood in stark contrast to my apparent failures. It allowed them to maintain their reputation within social circles while explaining away any questions about why their older daughter remained on the periphery of their affluent lifestyle. Most importantly, it justified their treatment of me as someone whose opinions, achievements, and contributions held no significant value. What made their narrative particularly effective was its foundation in carefully selected truths. I had indeed divorced my husband David after discovering his gambling addiction had consumed our savings and left us with substantial debt. I did live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-class neighborhood rather than the sprawling estates favored by my parents and their social circle. I had refused their offers of financial assistance on multiple occasions, citing my preference for independence over dependence on their resources. These facts, presented without context, painted the picture my parents wanted others to see. They omitted crucial details that would have completely altered the perception of my circumstances and choices. They never mentioned that I had refused their financial assistance because it always came with conditions designed to maintain their control over my decisions. They failed to acknowledge that my modest living situation was a deliberate choice that allowed me to invest heavily in building my business rather than maintaining appearances. Most significantly, they had never bothered to investigate what I actually did for work beyond the vague description I provided when pressed. The foundation for their misconceptions had been laid years earlier, during the immediate aftermath of my divorce when I had indeed struggled financially while rebuilding my life. During those difficult months, I had accepted temporary help with childcare and basic expenses. Assistance that my parents had provided with obvious reluctance and frequent reminders of my dependence on their generosity. When I began declining their continued offers of support 18 months later, they interpreted my independence as stubborn pride rather than restored financial stability. Their assumption that I remained in financial difficulty was reinforced by my lifestyle choices that prioritized substance over appearance. While they invested heavily in luxury vehicles, designer clothing, and expensive social events, I drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan, shopped at department stores rather than boutiques, and rarely attended events that required significant expenditure on formal attire. To parents whose self-worth was measured by visible displays of wealth, my choices appeared to confirm their assessment of my limited resources. The irony of their misperception was that my apparent frugality actually reflected the financial discipline that had enabled me to build substantial wealth, while they had been accumulating debt to maintain their lifestyle. The consulting firm I had established 3 years after my divorce had grown rapidly by providing technology solutions to companies struggling with digital transformation challenges. My expertise in systems integration and data analysis had proven exceptionally valuable to organizations attempting to modernize their operations, and my client base had expanded through referrals and reputation rather than expensive marketing campaigns. The business model I had developed focused on providing comprehensive solutions rather than quick fixes, establishing long-term relationships with clients who valued expertise over flashy presentations. This approach had proven extraordinarily successful, generating revenues that far exceeded the income my parents derived from their real estate development company. However, my preference for maintaining low overhead and reinvesting profits into business growth rather than personal luxury meant that my financial success remained invisible to casual observation. Emma had grown up understanding that our family's circumstances were more complex than they appeared to outsiders. At 15, she possessed a maturity born from witnessing the contrast between her grandparents' treatment of us and the reality of our actual situation. She had observed their dismissive comments about my work, their assumptions about our financial limitations, and their patronizing offers of assistance for expenses we could easily afford ourselves. More importantly, Emma had begun to recognize patterns in her grandparents, behavior that extended beyond their treatment of me. She had noticed how they took credit for achievements they had not earned, how they manipulated information to present themselves in the most favorable light, and how they consistently underestimated people they considered beneath their social standing. Her sharp intelligence and keen observation skills had led her to discoveries about her grandparents, business practices that would soon prove devastating to their carefully maintained reputation. The wedding reception provided the perfect stage for the performance of family dynamics that had been rehearsed over 15 years. My parents moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations on Victoria's successful marriage, while subtly reinforcing narratives about their family that positioned them as exemplars of achievement and responsibility. Victoria, radiant in her designer gown, embodied their vision of success: beautiful, appropriately married, and publicly aligned with their values and expectations. My role in this performance was to remain quietly present but unremarkable, providing contrast that highlighted their achievements while confirming their narrative about the consequences of poor choices. I was expected to graciously accept their occasional acknowledgement while demonstrating appropriate gratitude for their continued tolerance of my presence at family events. The script had been written long ago, and deviation from my assigned role would be interpreted as further evidence of my inability to understand appropriate social behavior. The conversation that had prompted my mother's devastating assessment began innocuously enough. A family friend had inquired about my work, expressing polite interest in how I spent my time. Before I could respond, my mother had smoothly redirected the conversation to focus on Victoria's accomplishments, while positioning my situation as a cautionary tale about the importance of making responsible life choices. "Elena tries her best," my mother had continued, her tone conveying sympathetic disappointment. "But some people simply lack the ambition necessary for real success. We've offered to help her find more suitable employment, perhaps something in administration or retail management, but she insists on pursuing these technology projects that never seem to generate sustainable income." Quote, "The casual dismissal of my work as technology projects, rather than a thriving consulting firm, revealed the depth of their ignorance about my actual achievements. They had constructed their assessment based on assumptions rather than investigation, preferring comfortable misconceptions to potentially uncomfortable truths. Their certainty about my circumstances was matched only by their complete lack of curiosity about the reality behind their assumptions." Standing at that bar, listening to my mother enumerate my supposed failures to an audience of influential people, I felt the familiar surge of frustration that had characterized family gatherings for years. The temptation to correct their misconceptions, to reveal the truth about my financial situation and professional achievements, warred with my long-standing preference for maintaining privacy about my success. The strategy that had served me well in business, avoiding attention while building strength, would soon be tested in the most personal arena possible. Emma appeared beside me, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes bright with an emotion I could not immediately identify. She had been observing the conversation from across the room, and her timing suggested she had witnessed my mother's performance in its entirety. The look she gave me combined sympathy with something else, something that seemed remarkably like determination. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that immediately captured my attention. "I think it's time we stopped letting them tell lies about who you are." The statement sent a chill through me, not because I disagreed with her assessment, but because I recognized the tone. Emma had inherited my analytical mind and strategic thinking, but she had also developed a sense of justice that occasionally overrode considerations of diplomatic restraint. The expression on her face suggested she had moved beyond frustration to decision, and that whatever she was planning would fundamentally alter the careful balance I had maintained for years. The wedding reception continued around us, the elegant performance of social success proceeding, according to my parents' carefully orchestrated plan. But something had shifted in the undercurrents of family dynamics, something that would soon transform celebration into revelation and expose the carefully constructed lies that had shaped 15 years of family relationships. The champagne glass in my hand had stopped trembling, replaced by a steadiness that reflected the growing realization that the time for passive acceptance of their narrative was ending. Emma's words had crystallized something that had been building for months, a recognition that allowing my parents to continue their deception was no longer protecting anyone but themselves. The foundation for everything that would follow had been laid years earlier, built on assumptions that were about to be systematically demolished. My parents' confidence in their version of events would soon collide with evidence that would reshape every relationship in our family, revealing truths that had been hidden behind carefully maintained facades of success and respectability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wedding reception at the Rosewood Country Club would be remembered not for Victoria's beautiful ceremony or the elegant celebration that followed, but for the moment when carefully guarded secrets were finally exposed, and the true balance of power within the Thornfield family was revealed to everyone present. The champagne would lose its sparkle, the crystal chandeliers would illuminate uncomfortable truths, and the perfect image my parents had cultivated would shatter beyond repair. But that transformation was still moments away, suspended in the space between Emma's determined declaration and whatever action she was preparing to take. The last few seconds of my parents' comfortable misconceptions ticked away like a countdown, each moment bringing us closer to revelations that would change everything we thought we knew about success, failure, and the price of maintaining appearances at the expense of truth. Margaret Thornfield commanded attention wherever she moved through the Rosewood Country Club's ballroom, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon that had required 3 hours at the most exclusive salon in the city. Her champagne-colored Valentino gown caught the light from the crystal chandeliers as she glided from conversation to conversation, orchestrating social interactions with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. Every gesture was calculated, every smile strategically deployed, every word chosen to reinforce the carefully constructed image she had spent decades perfecting. The woman who had just dismissed her elder daughter as the family disappointment wielded influence that extended far beyond the confines of this wedding reception. Margaret served on the boards of 3 major charitable organizations, held a voting position on the city's Cultural Arts Commission, and maintained relationships with politicians, business leaders, and social influencers who shaped opinion and policy throughout the metropolitan area. Her power was not merely financial, though the Thornfield family's real estate empire provided substantial resources. Her true strength lay in her ability to control narratives, shape perceptions, and determine which individuals received access to the networks that drove success in their social stratum. This influence had been decades in the making, built through strategic philanthropy, careful alliance building, and an intuitive understanding of how reputations were created and destroyed in elite circles. Margaret had transformed herself from the daughter of a middle-class accountant into one of the most formidable social arbiters in the city, a journey that required ruthless dedication to image management and an unwavering commitment to maintaining appearances regardless of underlying realities. Her husband Richard shared her ambitions, but approached their execution with different methods. Where Margaret excelled at social manipulation, Richard dominated through financial strategy and business acumen. His real estate development company, Thornfield Properties, had grown from a modest residential construction business into a major commercial developer responsible for transforming entire neighborhoods throughout the metropolitan region. Richard's success had been built on his ability to identify emerging markets before competitors recognized their potential, securing land and development rights that later generated enormous profits. Together, Margaret and Richard formed a formidable partnership that combined social influence with financial power. Their success had been mutually reinforcing, with Margaret's connections providing access to information and opportunities that Richard leveraged for business advantage, while his financial achievements provided the resources necessary to maintain their elevated social position. The combination had proven extraordinarily effective, elevating them from comfortable middle-class backgrounds to positions of genuine influence and authority. However, their rise to prominence had required sacrifices and compromises that they preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny. The carefully maintained facade of their success concealed methods and practices that would have damaged their reputation if subjected to thorough examination. Their treatment of Elena represented just one example of how they manipulated information and relationships to serve their interests, regardless of the cost to others. The pattern of behavior that Elena had experienced throughout her adult life reflected deeply ingrained habits that her parents applied across all their relationships. Margaret and Richard had learned early in their social ascent that controlling narratives about family members, business associates, and competitors provided significant advantages in maintaining their position. They had become experts at presenting selective information that supported their preferred version of events, while suppressing details that might complicate their carefully constructed image. Their approach to Elena's divorce had established the template for how they would handle any situation that might reflect poorly on their family's reputation. When Elena's marriage had begun deteriorating due to David's gambling addiction, Margaret and Richard had initially attempted to pressure her into maintaining appearances regardless of the personal cost. They had argued that divorce would reflect poorly on the family's values, and suggested that Elena should focus on managing David's behavior rather than addressing the fundamental problems in their relationship. When Elena had proceeded with the divorce despite their objections, her parents had shifted their strategy to damage control. They had crafted a narrative that positioned Elena as the primary responsible party for the marriage's failure, suggesting that her career ambitions had created tension in the relationship, and that her unwillingness to prioritize her husband's needs had contributed to his destructive behavior. This version of events allowed them to maintain their reputation as supportive parents, while explaining away any criticism of their family's stability. The effectiveness of their narrative manipulation had been demonstrated repeatedly throughout Elena's post-divorce years. Friends and acquaintances who had known Elena and David as a couple often treated her with subtle sympathy, clearly believing that she bore primary responsibility for the relationship's collapse. Business associates of Richard and Margaret expressed understanding for the challenges of dealing with a daughter who had made poor choices, reinforcing their image as patient, long-suffering parents who continued supporting their wayward child despite her repeated failures. Their control over family narratives extended beyond Elena's situation to encompass every aspect of their public image. Victoria's engagement to Jonathan Whitmore had been presented as the natural result of proper upbringing and family values, though the reality involved extensive behind-the-scenes manipulation to ensure the relationship developed according to their preferences. Margaret had cultivated a friendship with Jonathan's mother specifically to create opportunities for Victoria and Jonathan to meet under circumstances that would maximize their mutual attraction. The success of Victoria's engagement reinforced Margaret and Richard's confidence in their ability to shape outcomes through strategic intervention. They had identified Jonathan as an ideal match for Victoria based on his family's wealth, social standing, and business connections, rather than any assessment of compatibility or genuine affection. The fact that Victoria and Jonathan had indeed developed what appeared to be genuine feelings for each other validated their belief that proper planning and manipulation could produce desired results in any situation. This confidence in their manipulative abilities had led them to underestimate Elena's capacity for independent success. They had assumed that her post-divorce struggles would create lasting dependence on their support and guidance, positioning them to control her choices and direct her future according to their preferences. When Elena had begun declining their assistance and asserting her independence, they had interpreted her behavior as stubborn pride rather than restored financial stability. Their failure to investigate Elena's actual circumstances reflected a broader pattern of intellectual arrogance that characterized their approach to relationships and business. Margaret and Richard had become accustomed to being the most informed and strategic thinkers in their social circle, surrounded by people who either sought their guidance or deferred to their judgment. This environment had reinforced their assumption that they understood situations better than others and that their initial assessments were inevitably correct. The real estate business had particularly reinforced Richard's confidence in his analytical abilities. His success in identifying profitable development opportunities had been built on thorough research and careful analysis of market conditions, demographics, and economic trends. This methodical approach had generated consistent profits over 2 decades and established his reputation as one of the most astute developers in the region. However, his professional success had created blind spots in his personal relationships, leading him to assume that the same analytical framework that worked in business could be applied to family dynamics with equal effectiveness. Margaret's social influence had similarly reinforced her belief in her ability to understand and manipulate human behavior. Her success in building charitable organizations, managing board relationships, and orchestrating social events had required sophisticated understanding of personality dynamics, motivational factors, and group behavior. She had become expert at identifying what people wanted most and leveraging those desires to achieve her objectives. This expertise had proven invaluable in building their social position, but had also created overconfidence in her ability to assess and control situations involving family members. The combination of Richard's analytical confidence and Margaret's social manipulation skills had created a partnership that approached every challenge with absolute certainty in their superior understanding and strategic capability. They had rarely encountered situations where their initial assessments proved incorrect, or where their preferred outcomes could not be achieved through proper planning and execution. This track record of success had made them particularly vulnerable to circumstances where their fundamental assumptions were flawed. Their treatment of Elena represented the most significant failure of their analytical and manipulative abilities, though they remained completely unaware of the extent of their miscalculation. They had constructed their assessment of her circumstances based on visible indicators that aligned with their expectations rather than investigating the reality behind appearances. Their confidence in this assessment had been reinforced by Elena's apparent acceptance of their narrative and her consistent refusal to correct their misconceptions. The evening's wedding reception provided the perfect stage for demonstrating their social influence and family management skills. Margaret had orchestrated every detail of the event to reinforce their reputation as successful parents who had raised accomplished children, despite the challenges posed by Elena's poor choices. The guest list included influential figures who would carry stories about the evening's events back to their respective circles, amplifying the impact of any narratives established during the celebration. Richard moved through the crowd with equal purpose, engaging business associates and political contacts in conversations that subtly reinforced key messages about Thornfield properties, success, and their family's values. His discussions referenced upcoming development projects, charitable initiatives, and Victoria's promising marriage in ways that positioned the family as exemplars of achievement and responsibility. These conversations would generate business opportunities and social capital that would serve their interests long after the evening ended. The seamless coordination between Margaret's social orchestration and Richard's business networking demonstrated the sophisticated partnership that had driven their rise to prominence. They had learned to leverage every social opportunity to advance multiple objectives simultaneously, using family events to strengthen business relationships while using professional success to enhance their social standing. This integrated approach had proven extraordinarily effective in building and maintaining their influence. However, their mastery of social and business manipulation had created blind spots that would prove devastating when applied to their assessment of Elena's circumstances. They had become so accustomed to controlling narratives and outcomes that they had failed to consider the possibility that someone within their own family might be operating according to different principles and achieving success through methods they had not anticipated or recognized. The confidence they displayed while discussing Elena's supposed failures reflected their absolute certainty that they understood her situation completely. Margaret's dismissive comments about Elena's technology projects demonstrated how their assumptions had prevented them from investigating the reality of her professional achievements. Richard's occasional references to Elena's financial limitations revealed his complete ignorance of her actual economic position and business success. Their certainty would soon collide with evidence that would fundamentally challenge every assumption they had made about their elder daughter. The careful narrative they had constructed about family success and failure was about to be tested against facts that would reveal the extent of their miscalculation. The social influence and business acumen that had served them so well in other contexts would prove inadequate when confronted with the sophisticated strategy that Elena had been implementing for years. The wedding reception continued around them, providing the elegant backdrop for what would soon become the most significant challenge to their authority and reputation they had ever faced. The crystal chandeliers that illuminated their triumph would soon cast light on uncomfortable truths that would reshape every relationship in their carefully constructed world. The influential guests who had gathered to celebrate their family's success would become witnesses to revelations that would permanently alter their standing in the social hierarchy they had worked so hard to master. Margaret and Richard Thornfield had built their empire on the foundation of superior understanding and strategic manipulation. That foundation was about to be tested by an opponent they had completely underestimated, using methods they had never anticipated, with consequences they could not have imagined. The evening that was meant to showcase their ultimate family success would instead become the beginning of their most humbling education in the limits of their power and the price of their assumptions. The story of Elena's transformation from struggling divorcee to successful entrepreneur began not with a dramatic revelation or sudden windfall, but with a quiet decision made in the cramped studio apartment she had rented after her divorce proceedings concluded. Surrounded by cardboard boxes containing the remnants of her former life, Elena had sat at a folding table with her laptop, a legal pad filled with calculations, and a determination born from the absolute necessity of rebuilding everything from the ground up. The woman her parents now dismissed as a failure had actually possessed qualifications and experience that made her extraordinarily valuable in the rapidly evolving technology sector. Her master's degree in computer science from Northwestern University, earned while working full-time and raising Emma as an infant, had provided her with deep technical expertise in systems architecture and database management. More importantly, her subsequent years working as a senior analyst for a major consulting firm had given her insights into how large organizations struggled to adapt their legacy systems to modern technological requirements. During her marriage to David, Elena had deliberately maintained a low profile regarding her professional capabilities. David's ego had required him to be perceived as the primary breadwinner and decision-maker in their household, despite Elena's higher education and more substantial earning potential. She had accepted positions that underutilized her skills but provided schedule flexibility for raising Emma, while David pursued increasingly risky business ventures that he claimed would make them wealthy. The gambling addiction that ultimately destroyed their marriage had been partially masked by his grandiose claims about pending business successes that never materialized. The divorce had stripped away the comfortable illusions that had characterized Elena's married life, forcing her to confront the reality that financial security would depend entirely on her own capabilities. The settlement had left her with minimal assets after David's debts were resolved, but it had also freed her from the constraints that had limited her professional ambitions. For the first time in years, she could pursue opportunities that matched her qualifications without considering how success might threaten David's fragile self-image. The consulting firm that Elena established during her second year post-divorce had emerged from her recognition that mid-sized companies faced particularly acute challenges in modernizing their technology infrastructure. Large corporations possessed resources to hire major consulting firms for comprehensive digital transformation projects, while small businesses could implement off-the-shelf solutions that required minimal customization. However, companies with between 200 and 2,000 employees often found themselves caught between these extremes. Possessing technology needs too complex for simple solutions but lacking budgets for premium consulting services. Elena's approach had been to develop standardized methodologies that could be customized for specific client requirements, providing enterprise-level expertise at prices that mid-market companies could afford. Her first client had been a regional manufacturing company, struggling to integrate their customer relationship management system with their supply chain software. The 6-month project had generated $45,000 in revenue, while establishing Elena's reputation for delivering solutions that actually solved problems rather than simply implementing fashionable technologies. The success of that initial engagement had led to referrals that formed the foundation of Elena's client base. Word spread through business networks that Elena's firm could accomplish complex integrations and system optimizations that other consultants either could not handle or priced beyond reach. Her methodology emphasized understanding business processes before recommending technological solutions, an approach that resonated with executives who had experienced failed implementations from consultants who prioritized technical sophistication over practical functionality. Within 3 years, Tech Solutions Consulting had grown from Elena's one-person operation to a team of 12 specialists serving clients throughout the Midwest. The company's revenue had expanded from $45,000 in its first year to over $4 million annually, with profit margins that exceeded industry standards due to Elena's systematic approach to project management and her emphasis on building long-term client relationships rather than pursuing quick profits from expensive short-term engagements. The growth trajectory had accelerated dramatically when Elena's team had developed a proprietary software platform that automated many of the routine tasks involved in system integration projects. The platform reduced project timelines by 30 to 40% while improving reliability and reducing costs for clients. Rather than licensing the software to competitors, Elena had used it as a competitive advantage that allowed her firm to deliver superior results while maintaining healthy profit margins. The financial success of Tech Solutions Consulting had enabled Elena to make strategic investments that compounded her wealth beyond the income generated by consulting fees. Her understanding of technology trends had positioned her to identify emerging companies before they attracted mainstream investor attention. Her investment portfolio included early-stage positions in 3 startups that had subsequently been acquired by major corporations, generating returns that multiplied her initial investments by factors of 8 to 15. More significantly, Elena had used her consulting relationships to identify commercial real estate opportunities in areas targeted for technology sector development. Her clients often shared information about expansion plans and location requirements that enabled her to purchase properties before demand drove prices higher. 2 warehouse conversions she had purchased and renovated were now leased to technology companies at rates that generated substantial monthly income while appreciating in value as the surrounding areas developed. The most transformative investment had been her acquisition of a controlling interest in Dataflow Systems, a struggling software company whose products complemented Tech Solutions Consulting's service offerings. Elena had identified Dataflow's potential during a consulting engagement with one of their clients, who had expressed frustration with the company's customer service and product development priorities. Rather than simply completing her consulting contract, Elena had researched Dataflow's financial situation and discovered that cash flow problems had left the founders vulnerable to acquisition offers. Her purchase of Dataflow had required nearly $2 million, representing the largest single investment Elena had made since establishing her independence. However, the acquisition had transformed both companies by creating synergies that benefited all stakeholders. Tech Solutions Consulting gained access to proprietary software that enhanced their service offerings, while Dataflow gained financial stability and strategic direction that enabled them to capitalize on their technical innovations. The integration of Dataflow's capabilities had positioned Elena's combined enterprise to compete for larger contracts that required both consulting services and custom software development. The first major engagement under this expanded model had been a comprehensive digital transformation project for a regional healthcare network that generated over $3 million in revenue across 18 months. The success of that project had established Elena's reputation as a provider capable of handling enterprise-level assignments while maintaining the responsiveness and cost-effectiveness that characterized smaller firms. Emma had observed much of this transformation during her formative years, gaining exposure to business concepts and strategic thinking that most teenagers never encountered. She had spent countless hours in Elena's home office during school breaks and summer vacations, initially playing quietly while Elena worked, but gradually becoming curious about the activities that occupied so much of her mother's attention. Elena had answered Emma's questions about technology, business relationships, and strategic planning with the same thoroughness she applied to client presentations, fostering an understanding that extended far beyond typical parental explanations. This exposure had given Emma sophisticated insights into how businesses operated, how technology solved practical problems, and how strategic thinking could create opportunities that others overlooked. She understood that her mother's success had been built on identifying client needs that competitors had not recognized, and developing solutions that delivered genuine value rather than impressive presentations. Most importantly, she had learned to recognize the difference between substance and appearance, understanding that real achievement often remained invisible to casual observation. Emma's understanding of her mother's actual circumstances had created a unique perspective on her grandparents' behavior and assumptions. She had witnessed the stark contrast between Elena's professional competence and the dismissive treatment she received during family gatherings. She had observed how Margaret and Richard's certainty about Elena's limitations prevented them from investigating the reality behind their assumptions. Most frustratingly, she had watched Elena maintain diplomatic silence while enduring condescending advice and patronizing offers of assistance for problems that did not actually exist. The strategic thinking that had driven Elena's business success had also influenced her approach to family relationships. She had recognized early in her post-divorce recovery that correcting her parents' misconceptions would require more than simple assertions about her improved circumstances. Margaret and Richard had invested too heavily in their narrative about Elena's failures to abandon it, based on unsupported claims about newfound success. Any premature revelation would be dismissed as defensive exaggeration or wishful thinking rather than accepted as factual information. Elena's strategy had been to allow her parents to maintain their misconceptions while quietly documenting evidence that would eventually prove irrefutable. She had anticipated that circumstances would eventually arise where revealing the truth would serve a strategic purpose beyond simply correcting their assumptions. The key was ensuring that when revelation occurred, it would be comprehensive, undeniable, and timed to maximize impact on the family dynamics that had constrained her for years. This patient approach reflected lessons Elena had learned during her most challenging consulting engagements. Complex organizational problems rarely yielded to direct confrontation or immediate solutions. Instead, sustainable change required understanding underlying systems, identifying leverage points, and implementing interventions when conditions favored success rather than resistance. The same principles that had made her extraordinarily effective at transforming dysfunctional business processes could be applied to reshaping family relationships that had become equally dysfunctional. The documentation Elena had quietly accumulated over the years included not only evidence of her financial success, but also records of her parents' attempts to manipulate information about various family members and business associates. Emma had unknowingly assisted in this intelligence gathering by sharing observations about her grandparents, conversations, and behaviors during visits to their estate. Her youthful presence had often been overlooked during discussions where adults assumed children were not paying attention to important details. Emma's insights had revealed patterns of behavior that extended far beyond her grandparents' treatment of Elena. She had observed how they took credit for achievements they had not earned, manipulated information to present themselves in favorable light, and consistently underestimated people they considered socially or economically inferior. Most significantly, she had overheard conversations that suggested questionable business practices and financial arrangements that would damage their reputation if subjected to scrutiny by regulatory authorities or business partners. The most damaging information had emerged from Emma's accidental discovery of correspondence between Richard and several business associates that revealed systematic violations of zoning regulations and building codes in multiple development projects. The document suggested that Richard had been bribing municipal officials to overlook safety violations and environmental regulations that would have required expensive modifications to his construction plans. The savings generated by these illegal arrangements had contributed significantly to Thornfield Properties' profit margins and competitive advantages. Elena had initially been reluctant to use this information, recognizing that exposing her father's illegal activities would create consequences that extended beyond family relationships to potentially criminal prosecution. However, the pattern of behavior it revealed helped explain how her parents had achieved their apparent success while maintaining such absolute certainty in their superior judgment and strategic capabilities. Their willingness to manipulate regulations and relationships for personal advantage suggested that their treatment of Elena represented just one application of broader unethical principles. The revelation that would soon unfold at Victoria's wedding reception had been prompted not by Elena's desire for vindication, but by her recognition that her parents' behavior was escalating beyond acceptable boundaries. Margaret's increasingly public disparagement of Elena's supposed failures had begun affecting Emma's social relationships and academic opportunities. Teachers and administrators at Emma's exclusive private school had begun treating her with subtle condescension, clearly influenced by gossip about her mother's circumstances that originated from Margaret's social circle. More troubling had been recent conversations where Richard had suggested that Elena's continued independence was selfish and irresponsible, arguing that she should accept his offer to arrange employment at Thornfield Properties, where her activities could be properly supervised and directed. The implication that Elena needed professional guidance and oversight had represented a significant escalation from previous patterns of condescending advice and unwanted assistance. The final catalyst had been Margaret's announcement during the wedding planning process that she intended to establish a trust fund for Emma's education that would be administered by Thornfield family advisors, rather than Elena herself. The proposal had been presented as generous assistance for Elena's financial limitations, but its actual effect would have been to create legal mechanisms for her parents to control major decisions about Emma's future. The trust fund arrangement would have positioned Margaret and Richard as Emma's primary financial advocates, while reinforcing public perception that Elena lacked resources to provide adequately for her daughter's needs. Elena's response to this proposal had been carefully measured. Rather than rejecting the offer directly, she had requested detailed documentation about the trust fund's proposed structure and administration. This response had satisfied her parents' expectation that she would need time to understand the complex financial arrangements involved, while actually providing Elena with information she needed to prepare her counterattack. The legal documents Margaret had provided contained evidence of assumptions about Elena's financial situation that would prove embarrassingly incorrect when subjected to factual scrutiny. The evening's wedding reception represented the perfect opportunity to address these escalating challenges while maximizing the impact of revelations that would permanently alter family power dynamics. The presence of influential guests who comprised Margaret and Richard's professional and social network meant that any information revealed during the celebration would rapidly spread throughout the circles where their reputation mattered most. The elegant setting and festive atmosphere would make the contrast between appearance and reality even more dramatic when comfortable assumptions collided with uncomfortable truths. Emma's growing frustration with her grandparents' behavior had created an additional factor that Elena needed to consider in timing her revelation. At 15, Emma possessed the intellectual sophistication to understand the implications of her grandparents' actions and the moral clarity to find their treatment of Elena unacceptable. However, she also possessed the emotional intensity of adolescence and the sense of justice that demanded immediate action rather than patient strategic planning. Elena recognized that Emma's determination to defend her mother's reputation could no longer be contained through diplomatic restraint. The choice was between allowing Emma to act independently, with potentially unpredictable consequences, or channeling her energy into a coordinated response that would achieve more comprehensive results. The conversation they had shared at the bar moments earlier had convinced Elena that the time for passive acceptance of her parents' narrative had finally ended. The foundation Elena had quietly built over 8 years of strategic patience and careful documentation was about to be revealed in its entirety. The parents who had dismissed her as a failure were about to discover that their supposedly struggling daughter possessed resources, capabilities, and strategic advantages that far exceeded their own. The comfortable assumptions that had shaped 15 years of family relationships were about to collide with evidence that would transform everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and the true balance of power within the Thornfield family. The weeks leading up to Victoria's wedding had witnessed an unprecedented intensification of Margaret and Richard's interference in Elena's life, as though they sensed an approaching deadline that required immediate action to secure their preferred family narrative. What had previously been occasional condescending advice and unwanted assistance had evolved into systematic attempts to restructure Elena's circumstances according to their vision of appropriate behavior and acceptable outcomes. The campaign had begun subtly during the engagement party held at the Thornfield estate 6 weeks earlier. Margaret had arranged the seating to position Elena at a table with recently divorced women and struggling single mothers, creating an obvious classification that reinforced perceptions about Elena's circumstances, while isolating her from conversations with successful professionals and business leaders. The arrangement had been presented as thoughtful consideration for Elena's comfort level, suggesting that she would feel more at ease among women who shared similar challenges, rather than being overwhelmed by discussions of achievements and opportunities beyond her experience. Richard had used the occasion to introduce Elena to several business associates as someone who might benefit from entry-level employment opportunities in administrative or support roles. His presentations had been carefully worded to sound generous, while actually emphasizing Elena's limitations and need for professional guidance. The conversations had invariably included references to Elena's struggles with independent decision-making and her tendency to pursue unrealistic ambitions that prevented her from accepting more suitable employment arrangements. These interactions had served multiple purposes beyond simply reinforcing their narrative about Elena's circumstances. They had positioned Richard as a patient, supportive father who continued attempting to help his daughter despite her repeated poor choices. They had demonstrated Margaret's social leadership in organizing charitable assistance for family members who required guidance and support. Most importantly, they had created witnesses among influential community members who would remember the Thornfields' generosity and Elena's apparent dependence on their assistance. The success of these early interventions had emboldened Margaret and Richard to pursue more aggressive strategies for managing Elena's situation. They had begun scheduling regular family meetings to discuss Elena's future plans and financial arrangements, presenting these gatherings as necessary coordination sessions while actually establishing mechanisms for ongoing oversight and control. The meetings had been framed as loving parental concern rather than intrusive manipulation, but their actual purpose had been to extract information about Elena's activities and impose their judgment on her choices. During these sessions, Margaret had repeatedly emphasized the importance of Elena accepting realistic assessments of her capabilities and limitations. She had argued that Elena's resistance to assistance reflected stubborn pride rather than genuine independence, suggesting that continued attempts to maintain autonomy would ultimately harm Emma's opportunities and development. The conversations had included detailed analyses of Elena's housing situation, educational choices for Emma, and career prospects that consistently concluded with recommendations for Elena to accept more substantial family involvement in major decisions. Richard had approached these discussions from a financial perspective, providing lengthy explanations about investment strategies, retirement planning, and wealth accumulation that highlighted Elena's supposed ignorance about sophisticated financial concepts. His presentations had been designed to demonstrate superior knowledge, while revealing Elena's limitations, creating justification for increased oversight of her economic decisions. The complexity of his analyses had been intended to overwhelm Elena with information she supposedly could not understand, leading to grateful acceptance of his management and guidance. The pattern had reached a crescendo when Margaret had announced her intention to arrange supervised visitation between Emma and David, Elena's former husband whose gambling addiction had destroyed their marriage. Margaret had argued that Emma's relationship with her father should not be limited by Elena's personal resentments, and that supervised contact would provide Emma with male role model influence that she currently lacked. The proposal had been presented as consideration for Emma's emotional development, though its actual effect would have been to validate Margaret's authority to override Elena's parental decisions. Elena's response to this suggestion had been immediate and unequivocal. She had explained that David's gambling addiction remained untreated, and that his presence in Emma's life would create instability and potential emotional harm. However, Margaret had dismissed these concerns as overprotective paranoia, arguing that Elena's judgment about David's character had been compromised by divorce bitterness, and that supervised visits would prevent any actual problems, while providing Emma with paternal connection she deserved. The conversation about David had revealed the extent to which Margaret believed she possessed authority to determine what constituted appropriate arrangements for Elena's family. Her willingness to advocate for renewed contact with an individual whose destructive behavior had necessitated the divorce demonstrated how completely she had dismissed Elena's judgment and decision-making capabilities. The proposal had represented an unprecedented invasion of Elena's parental authority, justified by Margaret's assessment that Elena's limitations required external intervention to protect Emma's interests. Richard had supported Margaret's position by providing financial analysis that suggested Elena's economic circumstances prevented her from providing Emma with optimal educational and developmental opportunities. His calculations had assumed that Elena's income remained limited and unstable, leading to projections that Emma would face significant disadvantages unless family resources were deployed to supplement her mother's inadequate provision. The analysis had been presented as objective financial planning rather than manipulative pressure, though its conclusions had clearly been designed to support predetermined recommendations for increased family control. The escalation had continued with Margaret's announcement of the proposed educational trust fund that would place Emma's academic future under Thornfield family administration. The trust fund had been presented as generous assistance that would ensure Emma's access to premier educational institutions, regardless of Elena's financial limitations. However, the legal structure Margaret had outlined would have required Elena to provide detailed documentation of her income, expenses, and financial planning in order to demonstrate need for the assistance being offered. The trust fund proposal had included provisions for ongoing monitoring of Elena's financial decisions to ensure that family resources were being used appropriately to supplement rather than replace Elena's contributions to Emma's support. The oversight mechanisms would have required Elena to submit monthly reports about her income and expenses, creating systematic documentation of her supposed financial struggles, while positioning Margaret and Richard as responsible supervisors ensuring appropriate use of their generosity. Margaret's explanation of the trust fund had been accompanied by subtle threats about the consequences of rejecting such generous assistance. She had suggested that declining help for Emma's education would be viewed by family friends and community members as evidence of Elena's selfish pride, preventing her daughter from accessing opportunities that could transform her future prospects. The implication had been that refusing the trust fund would confirm perceptions about Elena's poor judgment while potentially damaging Emma's social and academic standing within their community. The pressure campaign had intensified further when Richard had arranged for Elena to meet with Harold Pemberton, a senior partner at Thornfield Properties who specialized in human resources and personnel management. The meeting had been presented as informal career counseling that might help Elena identify more suitable employment opportunities than the technology consulting work she had been pursuing unsuccessfully for several years. Richard had explained that Harold's expertise in professional development could provide Elena with realistic assessments of her qualifications and guidance toward positions that matched her actual capabilities. Harold's evaluation had been conducted with professional courtesy but underlying assumptions that reflected Richard's briefing about Elena's circumstances and limitations. His questions had focused on Elena's willingness to accept entry-level positions that offered stability and benefits, rather than pursuing entrepreneurial ventures that were unlikely to generate sustainable income. The conversation had included detailed exploration of Elena's administrative skills, customer service experience, and ability to work effectively under supervision rather than investigating her technical expertise or strategic planning capabilities. The consultation had concluded with Harold's recommendation that Elena consider accepting a position as administrative coordinator for one of Thornfield Properties' development projects. The role would have provided steady income with health insurance and retirement benefits while placing Elena under direct supervision that would ensure appropriate professional development and career advancement. Harold had presented the opportunity as ideal for someone in Elena's circumstances who needed stability and guidance rather than the uncertainty and isolation of independent consulting work. Elena's response to these escalating interventions had been carefully measured to avoid direct confrontation while preserving her strategic advantages. She had expressed appreciation for their concern and consideration, while requesting time to evaluate the various proposals they had presented. This approach had satisfied her parents' expectation that she would need extensive deliberation to understand the sophisticated arrangements they were offering, while actually providing Elena with opportunities to document their assumptions and prepare comprehensive responses that would address their misconceptions definitively. However, the cumulative effect of these interventions had begun affecting Emma's daily life in ways that made continued diplomatic restraint increasingly difficult to maintain. Teachers and administrators at Emma's private school had begun treating her with subtle condescension that clearly reflected gossip about her family's circumstances. Several parents had made pointed comments about scholarship students and financial assistance recipients that were obviously directed toward Emma's situation. The social dynamics at school had shifted to position Emma as someone whose presence depended on charity rather than merit. More significantly, Emma had overheard conversations between her grandparents and Victoria that revealed plans to establish Elena in supervised employment and living arrangements that would provide ongoing family oversight. Victoria had expressed concerns about Elena's ability to provide appropriate guidance for Emma during her crucial high school years, leading to suggestions that Emma might benefit from extended stays at the Thornfield estate, where her educational and social development could be properly managed. These conversations had convinced Emma that her grandparents' interventions were escalating beyond temporary assistance toward permanent control over both Elena's circumstances and Emma's future. The realization that her academic and social opportunities were being systematically undermined by her grandparents' public disparagement of her mother had created a sense of urgency that demanded immediate action rather than continued patience with strategic planning. Emma's growing anger had been compounded by her discovery of correspondence between Margaret and the headmaster of her school that discussed Elena's supposed financial difficulties and need for tuition assistance. The letters had revealed that Margaret had been actively cultivating perceptions about Elena's circumstances among school administrators, positioning herself as the primary financial advocate ensuring Emma's continued enrollment despite her mother's limitations. The correspondence had created official documentation of Elena's supposed struggles that would influence how teachers and staff interacted with Emma throughout her remaining years at the institution. The final catalyst had occurred during a family dinner at the Thornfield estate, when Richard had announced his intention to arrange mortgage assistance for Elena's apartment to prevent potential foreclosure proceedings that could disrupt Emma's stability. The announcement had been made in front of Victoria and Jonathan as evidence of ongoing family support for Elena's situation, though Elena had never mentioned any mortgage difficulties or requested financial assistance. Richard's presentation had assumed that Elena's consulting income remained insufficient to maintain her housing payments, creating justification for family intervention to protect Emma's living situation. Elena's attempt to clarify that she owned her apartment rather than renting had been dismissed as confusion about complex financial arrangements that she did not fully understand. Margaret had explained that Elena's tendency to misinterpret legal and financial documents had created previous misunderstandings about her actual circumstances, suggesting that Elena's beliefs about property ownership reflected wishful thinking rather than accurate understanding of her housing situation. The conversation had continued with detailed explanations about foreclosure prevention strategies and debt consolidation options that Richard could arrange through his business connections. The assistance had been presented as family obligation to protect Emma from housing instability, though the actual effect would have been to create financial dependence that justified ongoing oversight and control over Elena's living arrangements and major decisions. Emma's presence during this conversation had provided her with complete understanding of her grandparents' strategic objectives and timeline for implementation. Their plans extended beyond temporary assistance to systematic restructuring of Elena's life, according to their preferences and oversight. The scope of their ambitions had convinced Emma that diplomatic resistance would prove inadequate to prevent outcomes that would fundamentally alter her relationship with her mother and her own future independence. The wedding reception that evening represented the culmination of months of escalating pressure designed to force Elena into accepting their vision of appropriate circumstances and behavior. Margaret and Richard's confidence in their superior understanding and strategic capabilities had prevented them from recognizing that their increasingly aggressive interventions were actually accelerating their own eventual exposure and defeat. Their certainty about Elena's limitations had made them vulnerable to revelations that would demonstrate how completely they had miscalculated her actual position and capabilities. The elegant setting and influential guest list would soon provide the perfect stage for demonstrating the vast gulf between their assumptions and reality, transforming their moment of ultimate family triumph into the beginning of their most humbling education about the limits of their power and the price of their misconceptions. Elena's preparation for the inevitable confrontation with her parents had required months of careful orchestration that extended far beyond simply gathering evidence of her financial success. The revelation she was planning would need to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: correcting their misconceptions about her circumstances, exposing their manipulative behavior patterns, establishing new boundaries for family relationships, and protecting Emma from future interference. Each element required precise timing and strategic positioning to maximize impact, while minimizing potential counterattacks or attempts to dismiss the information being presented. The first component of Elena's strategy had involved establishing independent verification of her business success through sources that her parents would find credible and authoritative. She had arranged for Tech Solutions Consulting to be featured in a comprehensive article about emerging technology firms in the Chicago Business Journal, a publication that Margaret and Richard read religiously to monitor industry trends and identify potential business opportunities. The article had highlighted Elena's innovative approach to mid-market consulting and included specific revenue figures that demonstrated the substantial scale of her operations. However, Elena had carefully timed the article's publication to coincide with Victoria's engagement announcement, ensuring that her parents' attention would be focused on wedding planning rather than business news. The strategic timing had guaranteed that the article would be published and available for reference without immediately alerting Margaret and Richard to information that contradicted their assumptions about Elena's professional circumstances. The article would serve as independent corroboration when Elena eventually revealed her success, preventing any suggestion that she was exaggerating her achievements or misrepresenting her financial position. The second element had involved positioning key witnesses who could provide additional verification of Elena's business success and professional reputation. She had arranged for Jonathan Whitmore, Victoria's fiancé, to encounter Elena's work through his own professional network without realizing the family connection. Jonathan's pharmaceutical company had been considering technology consulting services to streamline their clinical trial data management systems, and Elena had ensured that Tech Solutions Consulting appeared prominently in their vendor evaluation process. Jonathan's subsequent investigation of Elena's firm had generated detailed assessments of her company's capabilities, client satisfaction rates, and industry reputation that would prove impossible to dismiss as biased or inaccurate. His professional evaluation had concluded that Tech Solutions Consulting represented one of the most innovative and reliable firms in their sector, with particular strength in solving complex integration challenges that other consultants had been unable to address effectively. The assessment had been conducted with the thorough due diligence that pharmaceutical companies applied to all vendor relationships, creating documentation that would serve as authoritative third-party validation of Elena's professional achievements. Elena had also cultivated relationships with several business leaders who moved within Margaret and Richard's social circles without directly revealing her family connections. She had attended industry conferences and professional networking events, where she had established her reputation as a thought leader in technology consulting, while building recognition among executives who would eventually encounter her parents at social gatherings. These relationships had created a foundation of professional credibility that existed independently of family narratives, providing additional sources of verification when her true identity was eventually revealed. The positioning strategy had extended to financial documentation that would prove irrefutable when subjected to scrutiny. Elena had engaged a prestigious accounting firm to conduct comprehensive audits of both Tech Solutions Consulting and her personal investment portfolio, generating official reports that detailed her assets, income streams, and business valuation according to generally accepted accounting principles. The audits had been expensive and time-consuming, but they had produced documentation that could withstand any attempt to question or dismiss her claims about financial success. More strategically, Elena had arranged for these audits to be conducted by the same accounting firm that Thornfield Properties used for their annual financial reporting. The shared service provider created additional credibility while ensuring that any verification requests would be handled by professionals who were already familiar with the Thornfield family's business practices and financial standards. The accountants would be able to provide comparative context that demonstrated how Elena's achievements measured against her parents' business success, eliminating any possibility that her accomplishments could be dismissed as modest or insignificant. Elena had also established legal protections that would prevent her parents from attempting to interfere with her business operations or client relationships after learning about her success. She had worked with her corporate attorney to create strict confidentiality agreements and non-interference clauses that would legally prohibit Margaret and Richard from contacting her clients or business partners in ways that might damage her professional reputation. The legal framework had been designed to anticipate and prevent the types of retaliatory behavior that her parents might attempt when their assumptions were proven incorrect. This strategic positioning had required careful coordination with Emma, whose role in the eventual revelation would be crucial for maximizing emotional impact while maintaining family relationships that could be preserved. Elena had spent months preparing Emma for the psychological dynamics that would emerge when her grandparents learned the truth about circumstances they had misunderstood for years. The preparation had included detailed discussions about likely defensive reactions, attempts to minimize or dismiss the information, and potential efforts to shift blame or create alternative explanations for their misconceptions. Emma's preparation had extended beyond simply understanding the revelation strategy to developing communication skills that would allow her to present information effectively while maintaining respect for family relationships that might survive the transformation. Elena had coached Emma on techniques for remaining calm under pressure, presenting facts without emotional rhetoric, and responding to defensive behaviors in ways that encouraged acceptance rather than escalation. The training had been designed to position Emma as a credible, mature advocate rather than an angry teenager acting out against grandparental authority. The timing of the revelation had been coordinated with several external factors that would maximize its impact, while minimizing opportunities for Margaret and Richard to control damage to their reputation. Victoria's wedding provided the ideal setting, because the presence of influential guests would ensure rapid dissemination of information throughout the social and business networks where Margaret and Richard's reputation mattered most. The formal celebration would make attempts to dismiss or downplay the revelation appear petty and inappropriate, while the festive atmosphere would contrast dramatically with the uncomfortable realities being exposed. Elena had also positioned the revelation to occur shortly before several major business decisions that would require Margaret and Richard to maintain credibility with financial partners and regulatory authorities. Thornfield Properties was in final negotiations for development rights to a major commercial project that required approval from multiple municipal agencies and environmental oversight boards. Any damage to Richard's reputation for competence and trustworthiness would significantly complicate these negotiations and potentially cost the company millions of dollars in lost opportunities. Similarly, Margaret was scheduled to present fundraising proposals to several major foundations that supported her charitable organizations. The presentations would require her to demonstrate leadership capability and strategic judgment to foundation boards that included many of the business leaders who would be attending Victoria's wedding. Any questions about her assessment abilities or decision-making competence would undermine her effectiveness in securing continued funding for projects that provided the foundation of her social influence. The strategic timing created a situation where Margaret and Richard would be forced to accept the revelation gracefully, rather than attempting aggressive damage control that might create additional negative publicity. Their upcoming professional obligations would require them to maintain composure and demonstrate mature responses to unexpected information, preventing the types of dramatic reactions that might otherwise characterize their response to having fundamental assumptions proven incorrect. Elena had coordinated her positioning strategy with Harold Pemberton, the Thornfield Properties executive, who had been assigned to evaluate her employment prospects. Rather than revealing her true circumstances during their initial consultation, Elena had used the meeting to gather intelligence about Richard's business operations while subtly probing for information about questionable practices and potential vulnerabilities. Harold's assessment of her qualifications had been based on assumptions provided by Richard, creating documentation that would prove embarrassing when Elena's actual capabilities were revealed. More significantly, Harold's evaluation had included recommendations for Elena to accept employment that would place her under supervision and oversight, suggesting that independent consulting work was beyond her capabilities and likely to result in continued financial instability. The written assessment would serve as evidence of how completely Richard had misunderstood Elena's professional situation, while positioning himself as someone qualified to provide career guidance to a successful entrepreneur whose business generated more revenue than several of Thornfield Properties' development projects. Elena had also positioned herself to reveal information about Margaret's charitable activities that would demonstrate similar patterns of misconception and poor judgment. Through her technology consulting work, Elena had gained access to financial reports and operational assessments for several nonprofit organizations that Margaret claimed to lead successfully. The reports revealed significant management problems, funding shortfalls, and strategic failures that contradicted Margaret's public claims about her effectiveness as a philanthropic leader. The nonprofit documentation would serve multiple purposes when revealed alongside information about Elena's business success. It would demonstrate that Margaret's assessment capabilities were flawed across multiple contexts, not just in family relationships. It would provide evidence that Margaret's social influence was built on misrepresentation rather than genuine achievement. Most importantly, it would show that Margaret's confidence in her superior judgment was contradicted by objective evidence of poor performance in areas where she claimed particular expertise. Elena had coordinated these various positioning elements through a comprehensive timeline that would allow information to be revealed systematically, rather than all at once. The strategy recognized that overwhelming Margaret and Richard with too much contradictory evidence simultaneously might cause them to become defensive and dismissive, rather than accepting the need to reevaluate their assumptions. Instead, each revelation would build upon previous information to create cumulative impact that would prove impossible to dismiss or explain away. The positioning strategy had also required Elena to maintain perfect operational security throughout months of preparation. She had continued attending family gatherings with appropriate humility, accepting condescending advice with gracious appreciation, and allowing Margaret and Richard to believe their interventions were gradually improving her understanding of appropriate life choices. The performance had required considerable emotional discipline, particularly when their advice directly contradicted her actual expertise and experience. However, Elena's ability to maintain this facade had provided crucial advantages for gathering additional intelligence about her parents, plans, and assumptions. Their confidence in her acceptance of their guidance had made them increasingly careless about revealing information that would prove useful when developing counter-strategies. They had shared details about financial arrangements, social relationships, and business practices that they would never have disclosed to someone they considered capable of using such information strategically. The final positioning element had involved establishing clear objectives for post-revelation family relationships that would guide Elena's communication strategy once the truth was revealed. She had determined that complete estrangement from Margaret and Richard would not serve Emma's long-term interests, despite their years of manipulative behavior. Instead, Elena had developed a framework for restructured relationships that would establish appropriate boundaries while preserving connections that could contribute positively to Emma's development and family stability. This approach required Elena to present revelations in ways that created opportunities for Margaret and Richard to adapt their behavior rather than simply punishing them for past misconceptions. This strategy recognized that permanent family divisions would ultimately harm Emma more than her grandparents, regardless of how satisfying complete victory might feel in the immediate aftermath of revelation. Elena's positioning, therefore, emphasized accountability and boundary establishment rather than humiliation or revenge. The comprehensive positioning strategy would soon be tested against the reality of Margaret and Richard's responses to information that fundamentally challenged their worldview and family authority. Years of careful preparation were about to collide with their established patterns of control and manipulation, creating confrontation that would permanently alter every relationship within the Thornfield family. The wedding reception that was meant to showcase their ultimate success in family management would instead become the stage for demonstrating the limitations of their understanding and the consequences of their assumptions. Elena's position as the overlooked family member had provided unprecedented access to information that Margaret and Richard would never have shared with someone they considered capable of strategic thinking or potential opposition. Their certainty about her limitations had made them remarkably careless about discussing sensitive business matters, personal relationships, and future plans within her hearing. The intelligence gathering that had occurred over the past 2 years had revealed vulnerabilities and questionable practices that extended far beyond their treatment of family members. The first major discovery had emerged during a dinner party at the Thornfield estate, when Elena had been helping Margaret coordinate catering arrangements in the kitchen, while Richard entertained business associates in the study. The positioning had allowed Elena to overhear detailed conversations about development projects that involved systematic violations of environmental regulations and zoning restrictions. Richard had been explaining to potential investors how Thornfield Properties achieved competitive construction costs by avoiding expensive compliance measures that other developers considered mandatory. The conversation had included specific references to municipal officials who received regular consulting fees in exchange for favorable interpretations of building codes and environmental impact assessments. Richard had described these arrangements as standard industry practices that reflected practical understanding of regulatory flexibility rather than actual violations of legal requirements. However, the details Elena had overheard clearly described systematic bribery that involved falsifying safety inspections, environmental studies, and structural engineering reports. Elena had carefully documented these conversations through detailed notes that captured specific dates, project names, and financial arrangements that Richard had described to his associates. The information had been obtained through her legitimate presence in the household, rather than through deceptive surveillance, making it legally admissible evidence that could be used to support regulatory investigations or civil litigation. The systematic nature of the violations suggested that Richard's business success had been built on illegal practices that generated competitive advantages worth millions of dollars annually. The intelligence gathering had expanded when Elena discovered that Margaret's charitable organizations operated with similar disregard for legal requirements and ethical standards. During volunteer coordination meetings at the estate, Elena had observed Margaret manipulating donor contributions to fund personal expenses and family business interests, rather than the charitable purposes for which the money had been solicited. The diversions had been disguised through complex accounting arrangements that technically remained within legal boundaries, while violating the spirit of charitable fundraising regulations. Margaret's approach had involved establishing multiple nonprofit organizations with overlapping purposes and shared administrative expenses that allowed for creative allocation of resources between entities. Donor contributions intended for specific charitable programs would be transferred between organizations to cover administrative costs, facility expenses, and consulting fees that actually supported Thornfield family interests rather than genuine charitable activities. The arrangements had generated substantial tax benefits while providing Margaret with discretionary funding that she used to maintain her social influence and political connections. The documentation Elena had gathered included financial statements, donor correspondence, and internal memos that revealed the systematic nature of these arrangements. Margaret had been particularly careless about sharing information with Elena because she assumed that complex financial structures would be beyond Elena's understanding. The irony was that Elena's expertise in systems integration and financial analysis made her exceptionally qualified to recognize and document the sophisticated fraud that Margaret had developed over years of charitable organization management. The intelligence gathering had accelerated when Emma began contributing observations from her visits to the Thornfield estate. At 15, Emma possessed the cognitive sophistication to understand complex conversations while maintaining the social invisibility that adults often granted to teenagers. Her presence during family gatherings had been overlooked by Margaret and Richard, who assumed that adolescents would be distracted by social media and personal concerns rather than paying attention to business discussions. Emma's contributions had been particularly valuable because her access to different areas of the estate had provided information that Elena could not have obtained through her own observations. Emma had discovered correspondence in Margaret's home office that revealed systematic manipulation of grant applications and foundation reports that misrepresented program outcomes and participant demographics to maintain funding for unsuccessful initiatives. The documents showed that Margaret had been reporting fabricated success metrics to foundation boards while using grant money to cover operational shortfalls in other programs. The investigation had also revealed that Victoria's engagement to Jonathan Whitmore had involved more extensive manipulation than Elena had initially realized. Margaret had orchestrated the relationship through carefully planned social events and arranged encounters that had been designed to maximize romantic potential while concealing the calculated nature of their introduction. The strategy had included detailed research into Jonathan's personal interests, professional aspirations, and family background that had enabled Margaret to position Victoria as an ideal match for his specific preferences and requirements. Margaret's manipulation had extended to influencing Jonathan's perception of Elena and Emma through strategic sharing of information that reinforced narratives about Elena's limitations and need for family support. The conversations had been designed to position Margaret as a thoughtful, generous mother-in-law who continued supporting her struggling daughter despite repeated disappointments. The strategy had created sympathy for Margaret's situation while establishing Jonathan as an ally who understood the family dynamics and supported Margaret's continued intervention in Elena's circumstances. Elena had discovered evidence of these manipulations through correspondence between Margaret and Jonathan's mother that revealed their coordination of social events and information sharing designed to promote the engagement. The letters had included detailed assessments of Victoria's suitability as a daughter-in-law and strategic recommendations for managing Elena's presence during family gatherings to minimize any negative impact on Jonathan's perception of the Thornfield family. The correspondence had treated Elena as a potential liability that required careful management rather than a family member deserving respect and consideration. The intelligence gathering had revealed that Richard's business practices extended beyond environmental and zoning violations to include systematic tax avoidance strategies that bordered on fraud. His development projects had been structured through complex networks of limited liability companies and offshore entities that obscured ownership relationships and enabled aggressive tax positions that probably exceeded legal boundaries. The arrangements had been designed by expensive tax attorneys who specialized in pushing regulatory limits while maintaining technical compliance with reporting requirements. However, Elena's analysis of the financial structures had identified several positions that clearly crossed legal boundaries into fraudulent misrepresentation of income, expenses, and asset ownership. Richard had been claiming tax deductions for charitable contributions that were actually disguised business expenses, reporting inflated construction costs that included payments to fictitious subcontractors, and hiding rental income through entities that existed primarily on paper rather than as legitimate business operations. The complexity of Richard's tax strategies had made detection difficult for routine audits, but Elena's expertise in systems analysis had enabled her to identify patterns and relationships that revealed the underlying fraud. Her documentation included flowcharts and financial models that demonstrated how legitimate business transactions had been manipulated to generate tax benefits that exceeded any reasonable interpretation of legal requirements. The evidence would be sufficient to trigger comprehensive investigations that could result in criminal prosecution and civil penalties worth millions of dollars. Emma's intelligence gathering had also uncovered personal information that revealed character traits and behavioral patterns that would prove relevant during the eventual confrontation. She had observed Margaret's treatment of household staff, service providers, and social subordinates that demonstrated consistent patterns of condescension, manipulation, and abuse of authority. The behavior had extended beyond family relationships to encompass anyone Margaret perceived as lacking power to challenge or resist her preferences. The observations had included detailed examples of Margaret's threats against employees who questioned her decisions, her manipulation of charitable volunteers through guilt and social pressure, and her systematic humiliation of individuals who failed to meet her expectations for deference and compliance. The patterns had revealed that Margaret's treatment of Elena represented standard operating procedure rather than unique family dysfunction, suggesting that confrontation about family relationships would need to address broader character issues rather than specific misunderstandings about Elena's circumstances. Elena had also gathered intelligence about Margaret and Richard's financial position that revealed significant vulnerabilities beneath their appearance of success and stability. Their lifestyle had been maintained through increasing debt and leveraged investments that created substantial exposure to market fluctuations and economic downturns. The real estate empire that provided the foundation of their social status had been built on borrowed money and inflated asset valuations that would prove unsustainable during any significant market correction. The financial analysis had revealed that Margaret and Richard's liquid assets were actually quite limited compared to their apparent wealth and social spending. Their cash flow depended heavily on ongoing development projects and rental income that could be disrupted by regulatory investigations or legal challenges to their business practices. The discovery had provided Elena with strategic leverage that could be used to influence their behavior during and after the revelation of her actual financial position. The intelligence gathering had culminated in Elena's discovery of Margaret's private communications with several family friends and business associates that revealed systematic efforts to damage Elena's reputation within their social and professional networks. The communications had included detailed character assassinations that went far beyond the public disparagement Elena had endured during family gatherings. Margaret had been actively spreading false information about Elena's mental health, parenting capabilities, and financial irresponsibility to prevent any opportunities for Elena to develop independent relationships within their community. The private communications had revealed the calculated nature of Margaret's public statements about Elena's circumstances. Rather than expressing genuine concern about Elena's welfare, Margaret had been conducting a systematic campaign to isolate Elena from potential sources of support or validation that might challenge the family narrative. The effort had included recommendations that community members avoid business relationships with Elena, warnings about Elena's supposed instability as a friend or colleague, and suggestions that Elena's presence at social events created uncomfortable situations that other attendees preferred to avoid. Elena's discovery of these communications had represented the final piece of evidence needed to justify comprehensive revelation of the truth about her circumstances and capabilities. The systematic character assassination had created circumstances where diplomatic resolution of family conflicts had become impossible. Margaret's behavior had escalated beyond family dysfunction into deliberate sabotage of Elena's social and professional relationships that demanded decisive response rather than continued patience with strategic positioning. The intelligence that Elena and Emma had gathered represented a comprehensive documentation of Margaret and Richard's questionable business practices, character flaws, and systematic manipulation of relationships and information. The evidence would provide overwhelming justification for Elena's eventual revelation, while demonstrating that their treatment of her represented broader patterns of unethical behavior rather than isolated family conflicts that could be resolved through improved communication. The scope of the intelligence had also provided Elena with strategic options for managing the revelation process and post-confrontation relationships. The evidence of illegal business practices created potential leverage that could be used to ensure appropriate behavior modification without requiring complete family estrangement. The documentation of character patterns would enable Elena to establish boundaries based on demonstrated behavioral history, rather than hopeful assumptions about future improvement. The wedding reception would provide the optimal setting for deploying this intelligence in ways that maximized impact, while minimizing opportunities for defensive counterattacks or damage control strategies. The presence of influential witnesses would ensure that any revelations about Margaret and Richard's character and business practices would be widely disseminated throughout the networks where their reputation mattered most. The formal celebration would make attempts to dismiss or minimize the information appear inappropriate and ineffective. Elena's years of patient intelligence gathering were about to be converted into strategic advantage that would permanently alter the power dynamics within the Thornfield family. The parents who had dismissed her as incapable of sophisticated thinking had unknowingly provided her with comprehensive documentation of their vulnerabilities and questionable practices. Their confidence in her limitations had become the foundation for their eventual exposure and accountability. Elena's systematic identification of potential allies had begun with careful observation of individuals who had experienced the destructive effects of Margaret and Richard's manipulative behavior patterns. The process had required months of discreet inquiry and relationship building to identify people who possessed both the motivation to support accountability measures and the credibility to influence outcomes within the social and professional networks where the Thornfield family wielded power. The first significant ally had emerged from Elena's investigation into the financial irregularities at Margaret's charitable organizations. Dr. Patricia Santos had served as executive director of the Metropolitan Education Foundation for 7 years before Margaret had orchestrated her removal through a campaign of character assassination and administrative sabotage. Dr. Santos had been terminated for alleged mismanagement of grant funds, though Elena's analysis of the foundation's financial records had revealed that the actual misappropriation had been conducted by Margaret through the complex inter-organizational transfers that diverted donor contributions to unauthorized purposes. Dr. Santos had attempted to expose these irregularities through proper channels, filing detailed reports with the Foundation's board of directors that documented systematic violations of fiduciary responsibilities and charitable organization regulations. However, Margaret's social influence with board members had enabled her to reframe Dr. Santos' allegations as defensive deflection from her own incompetence and financial irresponsibility. The narrative that emerged had portrayed Dr. Santos as a disgruntled employee attempting to avoid accountability for program failures and budget overruns that actually resulted from Margaret's unauthorized diversions. Elena's approach to Dr. Santos had been carefully calibrated to avoid appearing as though she was seeking allies for personal vendetta, rather than pursuing legitimate accountability for documented wrongdoing. She had arranged their initial meeting through professional networking contexts related to educational technology consulting, establishing credibility based on her expertise in systems analysis and organizational efficiency, rather than her family connections to the Foundation's leadership disputes. Their relationship had developed gradually through multiple conversations that allowed Dr. Santos to assess Elena's motivations and capabilities without pressure to commit to any specific course of action. Elena had provided Dr. Santos with independent analysis of the Foundation's financial irregularities that corroborated her previous allegations, while demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of organizational fraud that Margaret had successfully dismissed as incompetent misunderstanding of complex administrative procedures. Dr. Santos had proven to be an invaluable ally because her professional reputation and community standing had survived Margaret's character assassination campaign. The education community had recognized that her termination had been politically motivated, rather than based on legitimate performance concerns, creating sympathy for her situation while maintaining respect for her expertise and judgment. Her willingness to support Elena's eventual revelations would provide authoritative validation that extended beyond family disputes into documented patterns of organizational misconduct. The second major ally had been identified through Elena's investigation of Richard's development projects and their impact on local communities. Maria Rodriguez had served as president of the Riverside Neighborhood Association when Thornfield Properties had proposed a mixed-use development that would have displaced 43 families from affordable housing to construct luxury condominiums and retail spaces. The project had been presented to city planning authorities as community revitalization that would improve economic opportunities and housing quality for existing residents. However, Maria's investigation of the proposal had revealed that the affordable housing replacement promised in Thornfield Properties community impact statements would actually be constructed in a different neighborhood with inferior transportation access and community services. The luxury development would have eliminated affordable housing options while providing no meaningful benefits for displaced families or surrounding community members. Maria's opposition to the project had been based on documented misrepresentations in environmental impact assessments and community benefit analyses that Richard had submitted to secure development approvals. Richard's response to Maria's advocacy had included systematic attempts to undermine her credibility through suggestions that her opposition reflected ignorance about economic development principles and inability to understand complex urban planning concepts. He had characterized community concerns as emotional reactions from people who lacked sophisticated understanding of long-term neighborhood improvement strategies. The dismissive approach had reflected the same patterns of condescension and intellectual arrogance that characterized his treatment of Elena's supposed limitations. Elena's relationship with Maria had developed through her technology consulting work with nonprofit organizations that supported community development and affordable housing advocacy. The professional connection had provided legitimate context for discussions about systematic problems with development approval processes and regulatory oversight, that enabled profitable projects while displacing community stakeholders who lacked political influence to protect their interests. Maria's willingness to collaborate with Elena had been strengthened by her recognition that Richard's development practices represented broader patterns of exploitation rather than isolated conflicts over specific projects. Her community organizing experience had demonstrated that effective accountability required comprehensive documentation of systematic misconduct rather than emotional appeals about individual grievances. Elena's analytical capabilities and financial resources could provide the strategic support necessary to challenge Richard's business practices through legal and regulatory channels that individual community members could not access independently. The third crucial ally had been discovered through Emma's social connections at her private school. Jennifer Walsh served as the school's development director and had been responsible for managing relationships with major donor families, including the Thornfields. Her position had provided her with detailed knowledge of Margaret's attempts to control narratives about Elena's circumstances, while leveraging charitable contributions to influence school policies and administrative decisions. Jennifer had become increasingly uncomfortable with Margaret's insistence that Elena required financial assistance for Emma's tuition, despite documentation indicating that Elena's account was current, and payments were submitted promptly each semester. Margaret's efforts to establish narratives about Elena's financial difficulties had included suggestions that the school should provide counseling resources to help Emma cope with family economic instability, and recommendations for scholarship programs that Elena had never requested or required. The situation had become more problematic when Margaret had attempted to use her donor status to influence Emma's academic placement and extracurricular opportunities in ways that circumvented normal school procedures for parent involvement in educational decisions. Margaret had argued that Elena's limitations required additional oversight to ensure that Emma received appropriate guidance for college preparation and career planning. The interventions had been presented as grandmother's concern for educational excellence, while actually representing systematic attempts to undermine Elena's parental authority and decision-making responsibilities. Jennifer's professional obligations had prevented her from directly confronting Margaret about these inappropriate interventions, but her documentation of the incidents had created detailed records of Margaret's manipulative behavior patterns and misrepresentations about family circumstances. Her willingness to provide this documentation to Elena had been motivated by concern for Emma's welfare and professional recognition that Margaret's actions violated appropriate boundaries for donor relationships with educational institutions. Elena had also identified potential allies among Richard's business associates, who had experienced the negative consequences of his willingness to sacrifice partnership relationships for competitive advantages. Thomas Mackenzie had been Richard's development partner on 3 major projects before discovering that Richard had been systematically underreporting project costs and inflating profit margins in ways that reduced Thomas's partnership distributions while increasing Thornfield Properties' returns on their shared investments. The partnership disputes had been resolved through private arbitration that had required confidentiality agreements preventing Thomas from discussing the specific financial arrangements that had caused their conflicts. However, the settlement had not prevented Thomas from sharing general observations about Richard's business ethics and strategic approach that reflected patterns of deception and manipulation in professional relationships. Thomas's experience had demonstrated that Richard's willingness to sacrifice integrity for financial advantage extended beyond regulatory compliance issues into systematic betrayal of business partners and associates. Elena's development of relationships with these allies had required careful attention to their individual motivations and concerns to ensure that collaboration would serve their legitimate interests rather than simply advancing Elena's personal objectives. Each relationship had been built on shared recognition that Margaret and Richard's behavior patterns created systematic problems that extended beyond individual grievances to encompass broader issues of accountability and ethical conduct in business and charitable activities. The network Elena had assembled represented diverse perspectives and expertise that would provide comprehensive support for the eventual revelation of Margaret and Richard's misconduct, while offering multiple channels for ongoing accountability measures. Dr. Santos could address charitable organization fraud through foundation oversight and regulatory reporting. Maria could pursue community impact violations through municipal authorities and environmental oversight agencies. Jennifer could ensure appropriate boundaries for school relationships while protecting Emma's educational interests. Thomas could provide business community perspective on patterns of professional misconduct and partnership violations. Elena had coordinated with these allies to ensure that the wedding reception revelation would be supported by independent documentation and verification that would prevent Margaret and Richard from dismissing the allegations as family conflicts or personal grievances. The timing had been arranged to coincide with regulatory reporting deadlines and oversight investigations that would create immediate consequences for documented violations rather than allowing extended periods for damage control or evidence destruction. The strategic coordination had also established communication protocols that would enable rapid response to any retaliatory actions that Margaret and Richard might attempt after learning about Elena's actual circumstances and the extent of documentation regarding their questionable practices. The network of allies provided both protective resources for Elena and Emma and accountability mechanisms that would discourage attempts to escape consequences through intimidation or further manipulation. Each ally had been provided with specific components of the overall documentation that related to their particular areas of expertise and concern, creating redundant information storage that would prevent any single point of failure in preserving evidence of Margaret and Richard's misconduct. The distributed approach had also ensured that each ally possessed sufficient information to pursue independent action if coordinated efforts proved insufficient, or if Elena's family situation required her to step back from direct confrontation activities. Elena's preparation had included detailed contingency planning for various scenarios that might emerge following the revelation, including potential attempts by Margaret and Richard to discredit or retaliate against the allies who had supported accountability measures. The protective strategies had been developed through consultation with legal counsel who specialized in whistleblower protection and organizational fraud prosecution, ensuring that all participants understood their rights and available recourse if defensive actions became necessary. The support network had also been designed to provide ongoing monitoring and oversight that would prevent Margaret and Richard from returning to previous patterns of misconduct once immediate attention had subsided. The relationships Elena had built would continue providing accountability mechanisms that extended beyond the wedding revelation into long-term behavior modification and ethical compliance in business and charitable activities. The comprehensive nature of the support network reflected Elena's recognition that sustainable change required systematic intervention rather than dramatic confrontation. The allies she had identified and cultivated possessed the expertise, credibility, and motivation necessary to ensure that accountability measures would be effective and persistent, rather than merely symbolic gestures that allowed return to problematic behavior patterns once public attention had diminished. The wedding reception would provide the optimal setting for demonstrating the breadth and credibility of the support Elena had assembled while revealing the scope of documentation that had been gathered to support accountability measures. Margaret and Richard's isolation when confronted with comprehensive evidence of systematic misconduct would contrast dramatically with the network of respected community members and professionals who had committed to ensuring appropriate consequences for documented violations of legal and ethical standards. Elena's transition from passive intelligence gathering to active testing of her strategic position had begun 3 months before Victoria's wedding, with carefully calibrated interventions designed to probe her parents' assumptions while demonstrating capabilities that contradicted their established narrative. The testing phase required precise execution to reveal information about their defensive mechanisms and response patterns, without triggering premature confrontation that might compromise the comprehensive revelation she was planning. The first test had emerged from Elena's response to Margaret's proposal for the Educational Trust Fund that would place Emma's academic future under Thornfield family administration. Rather than immediately accepting or rejecting the arrangement, Elena had requested detailed financial documentation that would allow her to evaluate the proposal's structure and implications. Her response had been framed as gratitude for their generosity, combined with responsible diligence about legal and financial commitments that would affect Emma's long-term interests. Margaret's compliance with this request had revealed significant information about her assumptions regarding Elena's financial sophistication and analytical capabilities. The documentation provided had been simplified and summarized in ways that clearly reflected Margaret's belief that Elena would be unable to understand complex financial instruments or legal arrangements. The trust fund proposal had been presented with basic explanations of concepts that any financially literate adult would comprehend, demonstrating Margaret's certainty that Elena required elementary guidance about investment strategies and educational planning. Elena's detailed analysis of the trust fund documentation had identified several provisions that would grant Margaret and Richard inappropriate control over Emma's educational choices, while creating tax advantages that primarily benefited the Thornfield family's estate planning rather than Emma's actual needs. The discovery had provided Elena with evidence of her parents' willingness to use charitable gestures to advance their own financial interests while maintaining facades of generous family support. More significantly, Elena's follow-up questions about the trust fund's investment strategy and administrative procedures had been crafted to demonstrate financial knowledge that should have alerted Margaret to potential misconceptions about Elena's circumstances. Elena had inquired about asset allocation models, risk management protocols, and performance benchmarking methodologies that required sophisticated understanding of investment principles and portfolio management concepts. The questions had been designed to test whether Margaret would recognize evidence that contradicted her assumptions about Elena's financial competence. Margaret's response had revealed the depth of her commitment to maintaining existing misconceptions regardless of contradictory evidence. She had dismissed Elena's sophisticated questions as superficial knowledge acquired through internet research rather than genuine understanding of financial concepts. Margaret had explained that Elena's apparent familiarity with investment terminology reflected her tendency to overestimate her capabilities in areas that required professional expertise and extensive experience to navigate successfully. The interaction had demonstrated that Margaret's investment in her narrative about Elena's limitations had created psychological barriers to recognizing information that challenged fundamental assumptions. Her need to maintain intellectual and social superiority had prevented objective evaluation of evidence that contradicted preferred perceptions. The testing had revealed that Margaret would require overwhelming proof rather than subtle indications to accept that her assessment of Elena's circumstances had been incorrect. Elena's second test had involved her response to Richard's arrangement for career counseling with Harold Pemberton at Thornfield Properties. Instead of passively accepting Harold's recommendations for entry-level administrative positions, Elena had engaged him in detailed discussions about technology trends in real estate development and construction project management. Her questions had demonstrated expertise in systems integration, data analysis, and operational efficiency that extended far beyond the basic computer skills that Harold had been prepared to assess. The conversation had evolved into a comprehensive analysis of Thornfield Properties, technology infrastructure, and strategic planning processes that revealed Elena's sophisticated understanding of business operations and organizational development. Elena had identified several opportunities for cost reduction and efficiency improvements that could generate significant competitive advantages for Richard's development projects. Her recommendations had demonstrated practical knowledge of industry best practices and innovative approaches that required years of consulting experience to develop. Harold's reaction to Elena's unexpected expertise had provided valuable intelligence about how Richard's associates would respond to evidence that contradicted their assumptions about Elena's capabilities. Harold had initially attempted to dismiss Elena's insights as theoretical knowledge that lacked practical application in real business environments. However, the specificity and accuracy of her recommendations had gradually forced him to acknowledge that her expertise represented genuine professional competence rather than superficial familiarity with business concepts. The testing had revealed that Richard's network of business associates possessed greater intellectual flexibility than Margaret's social circle when confronted with evidence that challenged their preconceptions. Harold's eventual recognition of Elena's capabilities had demonstrated that business professionals would be more likely to accept revelations about her actual circumstances based on objective evidence rather than social narratives or family relationships. Elena's third test had focused on her interaction with the exclusive private school where Emma was enrolled. She had requested a meeting with academic administrators to discuss Emma's college preparation strategy and advanced placement course selections. The meeting had been scheduled during regular parent consultation hours rather than through the special assistance programs that Margaret had been promoting for families with financial limitations. During the consultation, Elena had presented a comprehensive educational plan for Emma that included analysis of college admission trends, scholarship opportunities, and academic program selections, that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of competitive university admissions and career development strategies. Her presentation had included detailed research about specific institutions and programs that aligned with Emma's interests and aptitudes, while positioning her for maximum opportunities in technology and business fields. The administrator's response had provided Elena with crucial information about how Margaret's narrative about their family circumstances had influenced institutional perceptions and treatment. The school officials had initially approached the meeting with expectations that Elena would require guidance about basic college preparation concepts and financial aid applications. Their surprise at Elena's comprehensive knowledge and strategic thinking had revealed the extent to which Margaret's characterizations had shaped their assumptions about Elena's educational background and parental capabilities. More importantly, the meeting had created opportunities for Elena to establish direct relationships with school administrators that bypassed Margaret's attempts to control communications and decision-making regarding Emma's academic experience. The administrator's recognition of Elena's competence had positioned her as the primary decision-maker for Emma's educational planning while undermining Margaret's narrative about Elena's need for family oversight and guidance. Elena's fourth test had involved her participation in a charity auction organized by one of Margaret's nonprofit organizations. Rather than attending as a passive observer who might bid modestly on inexpensive items, Elena had conducted thorough research about the auction offerings and prepared strategic bidding for several high-value pieces that would demonstrate financial resources exceeding Margaret's assumptions about her circumstances. The auction had included artwork, vacation packages, and exclusive experiences that typically attracted bids from the community's most affluent residents. Elena had identified several items that aligned with her genuine interests, while requiring financial commitments that would clearly contradict perceptions about her economic limitations. Her bidding strategy had been designed to create subtle questions about her financial situation without generating dramatic attention that might prompt premature investigation of her actual circumstances. Elena's successful acquisition of a premium vacation package that required a $15,000 donation had created observable evidence that her financial resources exceeded Margaret's assumptions. The purchase had been conducted with apparent casualness that suggested the expenditure represented routine discretionary spending rather than extraordinary financial sacrifice. The transaction had been witnessed by numerous attendees who would remember Elena's participation and might question narratives about her economic struggles. Margaret's reaction to Elena's auction participation had provided additional insight into her defensive mechanisms when confronted with evidence that challenged her preferred perceptions. Rather than reconsidering her assumptions about Elena's financial situation, Margaret had created alternative explanations that preserved her existing narrative. She had suggested that Elena's successful bid reflected irresponsible financial management that prioritized appearances over practical necessities, like housing stability and Emma's educational expenses. The testing had revealed that Margaret would attempt to reframe contradictory evidence in ways that reinforced rather than challenged her established beliefs about Elena's character and circumstances. Her psychological investment in maintaining intellectual and moral superiority would prevent objective evaluation of information that suggested her judgments had been incorrect. The auction incident had demonstrated that Margaret would require comprehensive evidence that eliminated alternative explanations, rather than isolated examples that could be dismissed or reinterpreted. Elena's fifth test had involved Emma's strategic disclosure of information about Elena's work to selected classmates and teachers who moved within Margaret's social networks. Emma had begun mentioning Elena's technology consulting projects and business travel in casual conversations that would eventually reach adults who knew the Thornfield family's characterization of Elena's professional circumstances. The information had been shared gradually and naturally through typical adolescent conversations about family activities and parental work, rather than through obvious attempts to correct misconceptions or promote alternative narratives. Emma's approach had created multiple independent sources of information that would eventually create inconsistencies between Margaret's public statements about Elena's limitations and Emma's casual references to Elena's business success and professional activities. The effectiveness of this testing strategy had become apparent when several of Emma's teachers had begun asking more sophisticated questions about Elena's work and expressing interest in technology solutions that Elena's company might provide for educational applications. The inquiries had demonstrated that information about Elena's actual capabilities was beginning to circulate within networks that included Margaret's social connections, creating potential challenges to the narrative control that Margaret had maintained for years. Emma's observations of adult reactions to information about Elena's work had provided valuable intelligence about how different constituencies would respond to revelations about Elena's actual circumstances. Teachers and education professionals had demonstrated genuine interest in Elena's expertise and accomplishments, suggesting that academic communities would be receptive to evidence that contradicted Margaret's characterizations. However, some parents and social contacts had shown skepticism that reflected their acceptance of Margaret's narrative and their resistance to information that might require reconsidering established assumptions. The cumulative effect of these testing activities had been to create subtle but growing questions about the accuracy of Margaret and Richard's assessments of Elena's circumstances, while gathering crucial intelligence about likely responses to comprehensive revelation of the truth. The tests had demonstrated that Elena possessed both the financial resources and strategic capabilities necessary to challenge her parents' authority effectively, while identifying the specific arguments and evidence that would be required to overcome their defensive mechanisms. The testing phase had also revealed the extent to which Margaret and Richard's confidence in their superior understanding had made them vulnerable to strategic deception and manipulation. Their certainty about Elena's limitations had prevented them from recognizing evidence that contradicted their assumptions, while their need to maintain intellectual dominance had led them to dismiss or reinterpret information that challenged their preferred narratives. The intelligence gathered through testing had enabled Elena to refine her comprehensive revelation strategy by identifying the specific types of evidence and presentation methods that would maximize impact while minimizing opportunities for defensive counterattacks. The wedding reception would provide the optimal setting for deploying this intelligence in ways that would permanently alter the power dynamics within the Thornfield family, while establishing new foundations for relationships based on truth rather than misconception. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.